All right. We are picking up where we left off yesterday. Um, chapter 19. It's called Mourning, as you mourn the loss of something. Not like, oh, it's morning. Um, maybe finishing up today. The next evening at 6 p.m., a ceasefire goes into effect. The war is over. At 132 hours, it is one of the shortest wars in history. Egypt lost more than 10,000 men, 90% of its air force, and $2 billion worth of its military hardware. The Jordanians lost 700 men, with 6,000 wounded or missing. Syria lost more than 400 men in those same 6 days. The Israeli army lost 800 of its soldiers and 20% of its air force, but it also reclaimed the old city and unified Jerusalem. Our apartment fills with relatives and friends who have come to sit Shiva with us. Throughout the 7 days of mourning, we'll sit at home while those who knew Gideon stop by to remember him. The mirrors are draped in black sheets. The kitchen is full of food. Everyone brings photos and stories about Gideon, from his excellent test scores to the scouts he led, to the soldiers who served with him in his all too short military career. They hug my mom, they sit with my dad, they reminisce with Benny and me about Gideon's escapades. Um, I'm thinking that maybe we don't do a good job of mourning. Jewish custom is 7 days of mourning. That's a full week that you mourn someone, the loss of someone, and that helps you to heal. I think in our culture, you know, someone dies, and in a couple days, we've got a viewing and a funeral, and then we're expected just to pick up and go back to our life before we lost someone. And I don't think that we mourn well. The afternoon of our first day of mourning, my cousin runs to our mailbox and brings up the mail. She hands a stack of envelopes to my grandmother, who begins to sort through the bills and correspondence. And she suddenly gives a small scream. All the conversations fall silent. What is it, Safta? I ask. What's wrong? My grandmother holds in her hand a light green military issued envelope, the kind that soldiers use for personal correspondence. The address on the front is written in familiar handwriting. Gideon has sent us a letter. He must have written it before the fighting started. With the chaos of the war, it took a while to reach us. My mom gasps. I can't imagine. She lifts the envelope to her nose, inhaling deeply, searching for a trace of her oldest son. We crowd around the light green military issued paper. My mom's hands shake a little as she opens it. It's as if Gideon has returned from the dead. I can't help but shiver. It feels like God has let my brother write to us from the other world. With one hand placed over her trembling mouth, my mom reads the letter silently. Everyone in our crowded living room watches as she hands it to my dad. Benny and I stand waiting. Though my soul shakes with the desire to read it, I wait patiently as my dad reads, then rereads the tidy handwritten lines, blinking his red-rimmed eyes fiercely. Then he hands it to me and Benny. We stand side by side, reading it together. To my parents, our commander has told all of us to take a moment and write down a few lines to our family. He says it isn't in case we die, but so that we're dear about what we're fighting for. I think he's right. Not that any of us forget for a moment we're fighting for our lives and our families, but it's good for you to be at the front of my mind as we head out. I don't think anything bad will happen to me. I hope that we will all see each other again. But in case we don't, I want you to know how much I love you. I count being your son as my greatest blessing. Oh, I'm having a hard time. Uh, you taught me about honor and hard work, and everything I am today is because of you. To Maudie, I know that I am sometimes hard on you. I tease you, I push you, but it's only because I see how special you are. Smart, quick, funny. Great things are in store for you. If for some reason I don't come back from this, I'm still with you. I'm still your big brother, and I'll be there with you no matter what comes. Listen to mom and dad. Take care of Benny. I love you. To Benny, I'll never forget seeing your little face for the first time. I was 12 years old. Mom gave me this little bundle all wrapped in a blanket. Only your red face was peeking out. I just lost my heart. You and Maudie are the best brothers that I could ever hope for. Listen to mom and dad. Don't be too hard on Maudie. I love you and I'm with you no matter what. All my love, Gideon. Benny is a slower reader than I am, so I hold the letter steady, waiting until he finishes. When he nods, I hand the letter back to my parents, who immediately reread the precious lines. My mother's lips move as she looks at the words, probably hearing them said in Gideon's voice. Benny leans his head against my chest as we watch them. I put my arm around his narrow shoulders, Gideon's last words echoing in my mind. Soon the letter is passed from person to person to my aunts and uncles and grandparents. Gideon's message makes everyone cry. A choking sadness fills me. It hits me once more that I'll never see Gideon again. We'll never have another letter from him. I'll never see his half smile before he makes a joke, or the true smile that fills his face when he makes us laugh. I'll never hear any more of the interesting ideas that he shared, or be able to turn to him for advice. All gone, forever. I'm desperate to get away from the well meaning crowd. Swallowing back the tears gags me. I don't want to upset my parents with more crying, so I slip out the front door, stepping lightly down the dim staircase. I have half formed plans of walking to the stadium, but as soon as I'm out of the building, I find Mrs. Friedberg sitting on the front stoop. I almost don't recognize her. The always impeccably dressed lady who spent a night in a bomb shelter without a hair out of place has her dress buttoned wrong at the collar. Her hair is unkempt. Instantly, I know she's lost someone she loves too. She is a woman in mourning. Who did you lose, Mrs. Friedberg? I ask, kneeling next to her. She looks at me in shock. Who did I lose? I lost Gideon. I lost our Gideon, a beautiful boy. Now that the rest of my family has come to our apartment to keep my parents from sinking into despair, Mrs. Friedberg has fallen to pieces. She covers her face with her hands, weeping. I feel helpless to comfort her when my own grief chokes me, but she pulls me into her arms, hugging me tightly. I don't swallow back the tears anymore, and we cry and cry, mourning our loss together. War is awful. In the days following the end of the war, the grandest sense of euphoria sweeps through Jerusalem and the entire country. When a stranger passing us on the street pulls my mom into a big hug and kisses her cheeks, my parents and I hardly blink. Everywhere, strangers embrace each other, feeling like one family. For the first time in 2 millennia, the Jewish people have fought, have won, and have united the city that lies at the heart of our religious identity. Some Holocaust survivors, like our neighbor, Mr. Pinsky, say that they have finally forgiven God for what they endured. The days pass in a blurry daze. There are moments when I forget Gideon died. I automatically think about telling him something, and then with a bitter, painful jolt, I remember he's gone. It makes me wonder how Mrs. Friedberg survived losing her whole family, how any one of those Holocaust survivors found the strength to move past their grief. Maybe I will too one day. I don't know. And this is the last part. It's called The Wall. When I think back on that summer in 1967, I have a clear, vibrant memory of the first time I saw the Western Wall. After we finished sitting Shiva for Gideon, we went to the Old City. My parents, Benny, and I, the four of us, joined thousands of other Jews, crying, laughing, cheering, carried along toward the holiest of holies. I walked on cobbled alleys that had seen 3,000 years of passing feet. The Jordanians who lived there came out to meet us. They waved and smiled as we passed. Children approached us, smiling shyly and holding trays with keychains and necklaces for sale. Many people bought their goods, excited to be interacting with Jordanians for the first time in 20 years. It seemed as if even though they'd lost the war, they were interested in us, curious about us. Maybe they were just pretending, but at that moment, I believed that they wanted to live in peace just like us. We avoided passing by the YMCA, the alley of death at Gideon. Instead, we wound our way through the narrow, twisting streets, and suddenly it was there in front of us, the tall, white wall that I had only seen in illustrations and photos. Each stone was massive, taller than a man, wider than a car. How the builders had moved such mammoth boulders 2,000 years ago was beyond my understanding. My mom and dad held hands as they approached. Later, there would be a partition separating men from women, but in those first heady days after the war, there was nothing to divide the tens of thousands of people who came to touch, to pray, to see with their own eyes the miracle of a unified Jerusalem. I remember my mom shaking, tears running unchecked down her face. I held onto Betty's hand so we wouldn't lose him in the massive crowd around us. We approached the wall. It was so serene, unmoved by the struggle and the cost we had paid to come see it. I touched a massive ancient stone, worn smooth. Someone next to me whispered the, and I'm going to mess up this word, Shehichiyanu under his breath, a prayer of gratitude for experiencing something for the first time. But I didn't want to say the Shehichiyanu. Instead, I leaned my forehead against the pale wall of Jerusalem stone and said the Kaddish, the prayer for mourning. At first, it was only me saying it. Then my parents' voices joined in, and Benny's. Then the man who had chanted Shichihinu added his voice. Then the couple next to him echoed our solemn prayer for the dead. Because, as the soldier who had come to my door had said, we were not the only ones who had lost someone dear. In our small country, losing 800 young men was a hard blow. The whole nation was both celebrating and mourning. So more and more voices joined our Kaddish, until thousands of people who had come to the Western Wall chanted as one, our voices rumbling in the square, rising higher and higher, a prayer of sadness and hope, grief and faith, and then we all said, Amen. That would be like incredible to experience that. Afterward, my father said, Come, let me show you where I used to live. We followed him through the ancient narrow streets. The buildings were so close to each other that unless it was high noon, the sun couldn't reach the street. My dad walked briskly through the shadowy lanes, confident of his way, even though he hadn't set foot there in nearly 20 years. Benny and I swiveled our heads from side to side, trying to take it all in. Many Jordanians had tied white shirts or scarfs to their balconies and front doors to let the Israeli soldiers know they had surrendered. People came out of their apartments and stood by their homes as we walked by. They smiled at us, waving. Ahlan, my dad would say as we passed. Assalamu alaikum. Alaikum. Wa alaikum, someone would say back. Benny and I exchanged googly eyes. Abba spoke Arabic? We walked for 10 minutes before arriving at a plain white building with a heavy, ancient looking wooden door. This was my house, my dad said, sounding far away. We lived on the second floor, my grandparents were on the first floor, and my aunt and uncle lived on the third floor. He cleared his throat violently. My mom took his hand in hers. We all gazed at the scarred door. I tried to picture my dad as a young boy, scampering in and out of this building, running through these twisting maze-like streets. What a different life he had lived. Where did your friend Daoud live? I asked. He blinked rapidly as if waking from a dream. Not far, he smiled. Let me show you. We walked for a few more minutes, though I couldn't tell the difference. My dad said we had left the Jewish quarter and were now in the Muslim quarter. A few streets away was a plain 3-story building almost identical to the one my father grew up in, except for the wrought iron door decorated in curves and loops. We stood there looking at the little house, not sure what to do. Men in long white robes and headdresses passed us, eyeing us with uncertainty. Women wearing long black robes hurried by with heavy bags of groceries in their arms. We stood out in our shorts and sandals. I thought about how my dad had said goodbye to his childhood friend 19 years ago, probably the same way I'd said goodbye to Yossi. I didn't know if I'd ever see Yossi again. I hoped so. I hoped his mother would be able to believe in Israel again. But if not, maybe 19 years from now, I'd be in my dad's position, staring at Yossi's old house, wondering what had happened to him. Maybe he still lives here, I said. You should knock. My dad rapped against the door frame. We waited and waited. Maybe they're not home, Benny said. And then we heard it, the turn of an old bolt. The inner door opened, and through the iron curves we saw a slim, middle-aged man with thinning hair. He had a worried look on his face that turned into puzzlement when he saw an Israeli family standing at his doorway. Yes, he said in Hebrew. Excuse me, is there a man named Daoud who lives here? Yes, he said, his puzzlement growing. I am Daoud. I am Abner, my dad said. Do you remember me? It's been a long time. Daoud's face grew brighter and brighter as he fit the memory of his childhood friend over the older face of my dad standing in front of him. Abner, he cried. My old friend! I can't believe it! He fumbled with the lock on the iron gate as he shouted something in rapid Arabic over his shoulder. Come in, I can't believe this! The door swung open and the two men fell into a hug, swaying back and forth. Daoud touched my dad's face, laughing in disbelief over the wrinkles. My dad teased him about the thinning hair. A woman wearing a colorful headscarf came from the back of the house, wiping her hands on a towel. She said something in Arabic, and none of us needed to speak the language to know she was welcoming us inside. The four of us entered the home of my father's childhood friend. Two girls and a young boy were inside playing with a model train set. They froze at the sight of us. Benny and I edged closer to each other. The parents shooed us toward one another. Before I knew it, a plate of cookies was put on a low end table and cups of sweet mint tea were poured for everyone. The adults sat and talked for an hour. Daoud had lost his brother in the war. His parents knew his parents' new house had been destroyed. My parents told him about Gideon. I looked at them, the two sets of parents, and for one disorienting moment, I couldn't see the difference between them. Why had we fought each other? Why had we lost loved ones? For one shining, hopeful afternoon, I thought it was over, that we would all live in peace, that we would all be friends. And why not? My family and I had just prayed at the Western Wall. We had scrawled little prayers on scraps of paper and stuffed them into the small spaces between the massive stones. There is a belief that prayers left at the wall will find their way to God's ear. Thousands of slips of paper daily, hundreds of thousands of prayers, and I think most of them are prayers for peace. As Daoud and my father filled each other in on the past 19 years of their lives, I thought, why not peace? Anything was possible. Can you get a picture of the Western Wall? The Ahlan Assalamu alaikum, that is peace be unto you, or peace be upon you. And then wa alaikum, and peace be upon you too. Mahdi's dad calls him brave. To do something that is right even while scared is brave. Um, Mahdi wonders how people who lost loved ones found the strength to move past their grief. I think that's a good question. Some people do move past their grief, and some people hold on to it for a really long time. And I think that has to do with your faith, being able to go past it. I wanted to show some pictures of the Western Wall and just how big it is. So here's a picture. The blocks of boulders, they're huge. And sometimes when people go to the wall from here, they will take prayers of people. We'll write them on um, little pieces of paper, and they take them to the wall and they stuff them into the cracks of the wall. And it has seen a lot. Think about that. 3,000. And here's lots and lots of people at the wall. 3,000 years of history the wall has seen. And then you can see the Israeli flag in the foreground. We're finished. This is the end of the 6-day hero, and we have basically studied some of the history of Israel. We are going to move on to another book, which also is about a different kind of war. Alrighty.